Hi everyone, my name is Saurabh Rawal and I am a consumer researcher at the Alberta School of Business, University of Alberta. Today I'll be talking about one stream of my research which is on re-understanding or rediscovering consumer wastefulness. This research is done in collaboration with Robert Fisher and Jennifer Argo, both from the Alberta School of Business's Marketing Department. So I'll begin with this notion about consumer wastefulness and the very idea that it's one of the most disconcerting outcomes of consumerism. So all of you must be familiar with the widespread consequences of waste. This includes, uh, discarding of materials which can cause harm to public health and increase the spread of infection and contagious diseases. So like disposing of or trashing our disposable masks. Waste is also known and has been established to affect wildlife. All of us must be familiar with that image of a fish or a bird or a turtle with plastic material wrapped around them. These animals often die of starvation after eating a lot of plastic waste. At the same time, waste also has a lot of consequences for the environment in terms of resource depletion as well as resource exhaustion. So in response to this problem of waste, several global initiatives have been taken. One of them, or probably at the forefront, is United Nations Sustainable Development Program. And among the various United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the one particular which is relevant to the topic of waste is goal number 12, which is about responsible consumption and production. More specifically, one of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goal, particularly Goal 12.5, is to substantially reduce waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling, and reuse. So the question is, since it's been almost 5 to 6 years since we have been putting a lot of effort in reducing waste, how are we doing and how are we set to do in the future? Unfortunately, research after research and data after data shows that the amount of trash that we are generating across the world, across different continents, is increasing. So if you look at this graph by World Bank, in the level of waste in terms of millions of tons of waste that we have been generating every year has been steadily rising between 2016 till date, and it is also expected to further continue to rise in 2030 and furthermore in 2050. So what could be the issue? Given the amount of effort that we have been putting in, it still seems that we have not been able to address the issue at hand. Every year, at least 2 billion tons of trash is still being dumped into landfills and oceans. So despite strong policy and research, it's very clear to conclude that we have failed to tackle this issue. In my research, I argue that one of the key problems over here is the way we have continued to conceptualize what really waste means. And let's take a background peek in terms of our understanding of waste and how that has developed. My primary argument is that a consumer-centric view of consumption has led to a consumer-centric view or definition of waste. What is the consumer-centric view of consumption? The consumer-centric view of consumption posits that consumer is the focal point of the economy or the marketplace, and therefore all activities within it are geared towards identifying or predicting consumer needs and wants. So trying to understand what consumers want and therefore giving them those offerings, delivering those offerings which consumers really value, and finally, most importantly, measuring outcomes of consumption from the perspective of the individual consumer. For instance, we try to understand things like consumer satisfaction, happiness, brand loyalty by examining individual consumer behavior. Waste is also an outcome of consumption. and therefore is defined based on how individual consumers perceive it is created. Specifically, waste is defined at their sole discretion if and when they discard goods and materials that consumers do not want or find useful. And this very idea of waste, this definition of waste, which focuses on the discarding of goods and materials, has resonated for a long time with researchers as well as policymakers. For instance, if you open up European Council's definition of waste, or if you look at United Nations definition of waste, they focus on defining waste based on waste as goods and materials which are discarded or intended to be discarded. Further, my argument is that this leads to several issues and creates a problematic consumer-centric view of waste. Specifically, it ignores the consumer-centric understanding of waste tends to ignore the externalities that are produced in society, because individual consumers are only focused on themselves, tend to be more focused on themselves and less focused on the actions and consequences on others. But we do know that externalities exist given we live in an interconnected world with finite resources. A consumer-centric understanding of the problem also leads to consumer-centric solutions, like imposing penalties. For example, imposing recycling fees on materials which are recyclable and asking consumers to deposit those recycled materials to a recycling depot, else they lose out on some amount of money. But unfortunately, this further reinforces the consumer-centric view that those who can afford to be wasteful can be wasteful. And this perhaps explains why some of the most affluent countries in the world also tend to be the most wasteful countries in the world. And finally, focusing on or appraising wastefulness based on the metric of discarding, or the extent to which materials have been discarded, or the amount of materials that have been discarded, puts an undue emphasis on waste management practices such as recycling over waste prevention practices. And this emphasis is clearly evident. So recall this target that I was talking about earlier, the target to substantially reduce waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling, and reuse. How does United Nations, or part of the Sustainable Development Goal, actually measures that? And the two indicators that are focused upon is the national recycling rate and the tons of materials recycled. Both of these are waste management practices. This is what you undertake once you have created waste and are focused on trying to undo the harm that is caused by discarded goods and materials. However, we all know that waste prevention ranks higher than waste management. This is very clear to most of us because of the famous 3 R's that prioritizes recycling as the last option and rather suggests that we need to reduce consumption, potentially reuse what we already have in order to reduce waste. So clearly, the definition that we tend to use, which is identifying waste based on what things are discarded, is inconsistent with our priorities in waste reduction, which is waste prevention. Moreover, we also know that recent research has shown that waste management practices such as recycling are unsustainable in the long term. For instance, research has shown that when consumers are given the opportunity to recycle paper napkins, they tend to use more paper napkins. So what essentially is happening is waste management is being replaced with overconsumption, which of course is unsustainable in the long term. Based on this, I propose a societal centric view of waste. The foundation is the very idea that waste is a human concept. It does not exist in nature. In nature, any output by an entity becomes a potential or available input for another. And therefore, this suggests that waste is something that cannot be understood from an individual's lens, rather at the systemic level. More specifically, waste needs to be understood as the extent to which a system uses what it has acquired or what is available to it. And this system-centric definition is what I refer to as the societal-centric definition in my proposed view. Specifically, I propose to redefine waste as the failure to responsibly use the entire utility of an acquired product, either by its owner or someone else. So what are the implications of this proposed reconceptualization? Whereas I have several implications to discuss, I'll focus on one or two key implications in my talk today. The first has to do with waste identification. The quintessential image in the consumer-centric view of waste is the garbage can or the trash can or the garbage bin. It basically signifies that waste, our understanding of waste is very stage dependent in the consumption process. The consumption process consists of acquisition, usage, and disposition phases, a very linear understanding of consumption. And over here, we only understand waste at the last stage of that consumption process, which is disposition. This also suggests that waste can be understood as an action-driven idea. As you look at that image, it clearly shows that a certain action, an explicit action, is what leads to waste. However, I have a slightly different, renewed understanding in the societal-centric view of waste. In the societal-centric view of waste, our understanding of waste is slightly stage independent. It does not depend on what we are actually discarding, whereas discarding is definitely a source of waste. What is a lesser understood source of waste, which is what I argue, is waste in storage. Waste in storage basically means everything, all the items that we continue to own but not use. And this not using of possession, while the society continues to acquire newer and newer products, creates a wasteful and an inefficient system that deprives others of the product's unused utility. So you can imagine all the bread makers, the toasters that you probably bought, the robot vacuum that you probably bought, the 3 pairs of white shirt or 3 denim pants that you got, same color, and one of them is sitting at the back of your wardrobe for the last 1 or 2 years without being used. While you have not discarded those products, it is still a source of waste in society because it is depriving others of the product's unused utility. That's what the societal-centric view of waste is about. What it also suggests is that waste need not be action-driven and can be inaction-driven. You may not be taking an explicit choice of putting things into storage over long periods of time. You may buy a toaster, use it for a month or 2, and then suddenly you stop using it, and without realizing 2 years have gone and you haven't used it at all. So while it is coming from not using the product, waste is emerging from not using the product, it is essentially it's not a consciously driven action that you're taking to identify waste. It's an inaction driven process. And the most interesting thing about this idea of waste that can occur in storage is that it is counterintuitive. Research after research has shown that people think that storing things instead of discarding them or just storing things is actually a wise and a prudent choice. Whereas that might be the case for individual, from the society's viewpoint, we are depriving it of the product's unused utility. And therefore others who are in need of that product, that could include people who want to buy it on marketplaces or people who are in need in terms of charity, like Goodwill, Salvation Army, Value Village, and several others. So we're depriving people who are in need of this product of the unused utility of the product, and they go out and buy a newer product which consumes newer virgin resources from the environment, thus creating an inefficient system. It also has implications for waste reduction. So when waste can be identified even before things are discarded, a source of waste can be identified even before you throw something into the trash can, you are able to focus on waste prevention practices, which would include things like giving the product to someone else who might be able to use it, or sharing the product with your neighbors, or renting out a product, let's say an unused car, to someone else who might be able to use it. And these are the principles of waste prevention rather than waste management. And that's the idea, that how my renewed understanding of waste can focus on waste prevention practices. What it also does, interestingly, is differentiate between overlapping concepts like pollution, which have a very downstream understanding or a downstream effect focus. So for instance, when we focus on defining waste based on things that are discarded, we worry about what this discarded output is going to do, which is essentially polluting the environment and causing different kinds of damage on the environment, on humans as well as animals. Whereas my redefinition really tries to focus on the kind of upstream effects that also occur with the concept of waste, which is things like resource depletion. So if we are able to, as a society, if we are able to efficiently use what we have already got without buying newer things, or actually sharing or renting things to others rather than discarding them or holding on for over long periods of time, we are essentially able to reduce resource depletion. And finally, waste reduction implication that I would like to talk about is the idea of repurposing. Repurposing has always been thought of as a disposition strategy. That is, instead of throwing something, you might want to reconsider and repurpose it for something else. But does that really solve a problem? Because we might not need the new repurposed material. Repurposing, instead of being thought of as a disposition strategy, it should be thought of as an acquisition strategy, which is what my understanding of waste gets at. Which is, instead of acquiring a new product, I should consider repurposing what I already have to fulfill my needs and wants. So this is what I wanted to leave you with. Please feel free to send your questions and comments on this email address, and thank you for your time.